What is up, everybody? Big Ten Live episode 3. 3 episodes in, and Mark still has me here doing these things, which means I haven't completely screwed it up yet. And if you haven't noticed, we have a really awesome, really big guest on this week. The first guest, and I didn't even mention this to you backstage, Sam. The first guest on Big Ten Live with Darren. Yes, I am your host, also the host of Darren Talks Ball. Our first guest, Sam of College Football with Sam fame. I feel like I should introduce you, but I feel like a lot of people might already be familiar with you out there. Sam, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing, I'd say okay, but talking about college football makes things better. So
Absolutely.
I'm excited for this.
Well, we're about to talk a ton of college football because there were a ton of great games this weekend, including what I think might have been the best game of the year, which we'll get into in just a second, of course. But before we really get into it, I want to remind everybody to give this video a like, help get it up into that almighty Google/YouTube algorithm, help this channel here continue to grow. I, of course, just took over as a host of Big Ten Live and will be here for as long as you guys support this whole thing. So let's keep it rolling. Like the video, share this around, subscribe to the Big Ten channel at the Voice of College Football. I personally am trying to outgrow the SEC channel over there. They're our main rivals. They're the guys that we're chasing down. So we're going to get all that out of the way, of course, do all that. And we're going to get right into it with Sam because, well, I know Sam really, really desperately really wants to talk about this game. Ohio State, Oregon, perhaps one of, if not the best game of the year. And I know Alabama, Georgia was all over the fireworks and everything. And Penn State, USC, which we're also going to get into, was a great game too.
This game was better than Alabama, Georgia. And
you think so?
Features better teams too. Like both of these teams are better than both of Alabama.
Absolutely. Georgia, absolutely. Yeah. And honestly, just to get into it here, Will Howard at times can play right up to the level of those quarterbacks for either of those teams too. I have been very impressed with Will Howard so far this season. This game, of course, like you said, close in nearly every metric. The total yards in this game were 496 to 467. The rushing yards were 155 to 141. Passing yards were 341 to 326. Yards per rush average was 5 to 4.3. 21 first downs to 18. There was only one turnover in this game, by the way, which was the crazy Derek Harmon ripping the ball away from Quinshon Judkins play. There was a play that a lot of Oregon fans thought could have been an interception. Maybe it reminded me a lot of the Roman Wilson, Denzel Burke play from the Michigan game last year. Yeah. But only one turnover in this game. I think personally the difference in this game really was OSU committed a few more penalties, had a lot of penalty yards, and Oregon stole a couple possessions away from Ohio State with the onside kick that may not have been an actual onside kick. And of course, the turnover. So what do you say? What say you, Sam, about this game? Because I know you're already excited to talk about it.
It reminded me, I said in my reaction to this, that it reminded me of the Oregon versus Washington games of the previous 2 seasons and the Michigan-Ohio State games of the previous 2 seasons. But there's another analogy that may even fit better, and that is, remember 2 seasons ago now, I can't believe it was that long ago, when Utah and USC played, and it was a back and forth, like 43-42 was the final. Mm-hmm. Ironically, another 1-point win for the home team.
Mm-hmm.
That's what this game reminded me of, where the team that won achieved victory because they were slightly more physical and they were way more gutsy, and that was able to overcome the athletic advantage of the visitor. That's kind of, I think, a short summary.
I think it's a good one too. But yeah, we'll get more in depth on it because, of course, I want to focus on this game for a little bit here. But I like the fact that you bring up the physicality, because I did my recap and reaction video over at Darren Talks Ball already, and I had a few fans commenting on how, Oregon wasn't actually that much more physical than Ohio State or vice versa. I actually personally thought it was pretty close in terms of physicality, in terms of trench play and things like that, which made this a very close game. But ultimately, looking back on it, I do think that Oregon was a slightly more physical team, which is surprising because, Ohio State has had a very good offensive line so far this season. All credit to Ohio State. My main critique of them the past few years has been especially that right side of the offensive line not being very good. And then also the defensive line. I think at this point, JTT and Jack Sawyer, speaking of physicality, are two very physical edge players, but they're also kind of just what they are at this point. They're not exactly the best speed rushers, and neither of them kind of has that like third move that you really look for in an edge rusher for either of those guys. But yeah, this was really close in terms of physicality, but I do think Oregon edged out Ohio State. And I want to get your thoughts on this because I really think one of the few things that not too many people are mentioning as well that was a big factor in this game was the return of Jeffrey Bassa at linebacker for Oregon. I think him kind of tracking down Henderson and Judkins on a lot of those like outside zone and stretch plays that Ohio State runs. There were a few of them that just went into the boundary after like a 2 or 3 yard game, mostly because Bassa just chased them down with his sideline to sideline range. So what do you think of Oregon's performance, I guess, specifically on the defensive side of the ball in this one?
I think that the Derek Harmon forced fumble was kind of the epitome of the physicality battle, where Ohio State, in the first 5 games of the season, really first 4, including the Michigan State game, I felt like Ohio State was out athleting everyone, and they weren't really showcasing if they had gotten better in the trenches. Well, then the Iowa game happened, and Ohio State ran for 5 yards per carry on nearly 40 rushing attempts and was pushing Iowa everywhere. And they didn't let Caleb Johnson do anything until the fourth quarter. So I thought, oh my goodness, well, problem solved. Well, I don't think Ohio State is lacking in physicality relative to just the average college football team. They're way more physical and tough and obviously more athletic than the average college football team or the average Big Ten team. But Oregon had leveled the playing field athletically. And that was clear with what you said about Bassa chasing down Henderson or Judkins, or the fact that Howard had to really throw the ball perfectly to complete passes. And very rarely were his receivers were compensating for other aspects of the team, not named Will Howard, who I thought had a really good day, maybe the best day of his career. And when the playing field athletically was leveled, well, it just honestly became, well, who's going to be the tougher team? Who's going to be the more aggressive team? Athleticism is basically neutral. So it comes down to all these other factors. And Oregon was just not drastically better, but slightly better in game management, in running the football, in creativity, in so many things. Football is a game of inches, but the inches piled up.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
the fact that Oregon, they missed a field goal, they missed an extra point, they had a stupid 2-point conversion play. They had Tez Johnson wide open on 4th and goal and missed him. Like, they could have won by 10, but they also did some things that helped them to not lose the football game. So I come away from this game thinking that both teams have a lot to work on defensively, especially Ohio State. I think Oregon, what was impressive about them defensively specifically was how they tried to be creative. They tried to send pressure. They did a good job of completely neutralizing the point of attack. Ohio State's offensive line could open up holes, but they never really got push. There wasn't, they didn't get push, especially on the plays they needed to. That's why Oregon stopped them on like 3rd and 1 twice, and they have the 2 best running backs, or the best running back duo. I don't know about the 2 best running backs, but the best running back duo in all of college football.
The best duo, because, sorry to interrupt you, Ashton Jeanty is out here, and I've been singing his praises since the beginning of the season. But
no, all good. Interrupt when need. And Jeanty is exactly, that's why I retracted that statement. He's in his own tier. But even with that talent, they couldn't do all that much outside of those 2 long runs. If you take away Travion Henderson's long carry, which I believe was 53, Ohio State only averaged 2.7 yards per carry. It was a total,
that's crazy.
Yeah.
I didn't break it
Yes.
down that way yet. So full disclosure, I didn't really look at the rushing. I just looked at the rushing yard totals and the average per carry, but that's wow.
Yeah, and then I think he had another one of like 20 something. You take that
Mhm.
away, that's like close to 2 flat.
Yeah.
They weren't
Yeah.
doing much outside
Mhm.
of some of those early runs, and then sadly when Simmons went out, and I also think Oregon defensively did a much better job of making adjustments than Ohio State's defense did as
Yeah.
the game went on. They only ran it. The Buckeyes did 7 times in the second half.
Mhm.
7 times, and most of them were stopped for no gain or 1 yard.
Which
They
was
couldn't run the football.
Which was crazy because Ohio State had the lead at several points. Like, you didn't need to throw the football so much. And to your point on the physicality, especially the offensive line, what I saw a lot of was that kind of failure. And Ohio State doesn't call a ton of like duo and that's things that kind of like is typical of like a Michigan style running team. But regardless of the specific running plays you're calling or the specific scheme you have, they all want to achieve that goal of getting to the second level, getting center or guard on any given play up on a linebacker, right? That's how you really seal a run play. And maybe a running back has to deal with like one free hitter. That's your goal all the time, right? Is they have to deal with one linebacker or one safety, and you're hoping they can break that tackle and they can get a really big gain. But on several of the carries for Ohio State, especially down the stretch, it wasn't just one free hitter. It was, Derek Harmon and company taking up blocks, not allowing linemen to get to the second level. And then you've got Jeffrey Bassa, you've got Bryce Betcher, you've got guys in there, you've got Kobe Savage coming down. There's multiple free hitters on these runs, and it's crazy. I talked about it all off season leading into the season. And I will say, I feel a little bit of, I'm just going to pat myself on the back for just a moment because I predicted this game would go 34-31 in Oregon's favor. And had they made that extra point, it would have been all that closer to my score prediction. But I've been saying all off season because a lot of people on my channel, I don't know about yours, have talked about, these Pac-12 teams coming into the Big Ten. They don't know what it's like to deal with Big Ten physicality. They don't know, their finesse teams and kind of all the stereotypes perpetuate, right? But Dan Lanning has built Oregon into a very physical program, a very athletic and physical program. And they just played who I personally think, and I think you would agree with me, the best roster in college football. And they handled them. They didn't allow Ohio State to do what you just talked about, which was they kind of out athlete everybody Ohio State does. And I really do think, to your point too, the game management and especially the time management down the stretch, man, Ryan Day has some issues there because between, the Georgia game, what was it, a couple seasons ago in the playoff, and now this one, you have opportunities to close out big games and your team has the ball in kind of the fringe red area with a minute left and you utterly fail in this one to close it out.
Yeah, he in Day is way too reactive. He's too receptive to outside pressure. That's why the whole Lou Holtz thing, which I didn't necessarily have a big problem with, but that's why that happened. That's why he started talking about physicality after the Michigan loss,
Mm-hmm.
um, and a few other things. I mean, I also think that's part of why he is a much better human being than, let's say, Urban Meyer. I also think that right now he's a better head coach too. The Big Ten's gotten a lot tougher since Urban Meyer retired.
That's
But
true.
you look here at because let's actually focus. Let's take a deep dive into those final seconds, the final minute. So I think that running the ball against Georgia and also running the ball here on that play when they were inside the 35, that was the correct move.
Mm-hmm.
Against Georgia, it just failed. And sometimes the
Yeah.
correct play call fails. And only in hindsight do you realize maybe try something else. But that's with hindsight. No one has
Mm-hmm.
that privilege. This game, Oregon, I know that Harmon and Caldwell and Uyunglele were doing a very good job. And also, give credit to Lupoy and Lanning for recruiting and also play calling. Oregon's D-line looked deeper than Ohio State's. Like, they
Mm-hmm.
weren't getting tired. Ohio State's D-line, it looked like Illinois, Nebraska from a few weeks ago, and Nebraska's defense just broke in overtime.
That's a good point.
That's
Yeah.
what Ohio State's D-line looked like.
And similarly,
Toward the end.
Nebraska has a really great defense this year. I think they're actually first,
In
if I
SP
remember, in
plus.
SP plus defense this week. Yeah, I was doing a little research for their upcoming game this week. earlier today. But similarly, yeah, great defense, but you really have to wonder about, and a lot of people don't mention this. I think it gets overlooked a lot. And I think with Michigan, the Michigan team last year was a great example of this, and it finally started getting talked about a lot about more, I should say. But depth is so important in these big games down the stretch. Like how wore out is your defensive line in the fourth quarter, and especially in a physical game like this. Yeah, it was a great game. It was a physical game. Ohio State, I think, remains a really great team. And especially when you look at their schedule down the stretch, I don't have it pulled up here, but you're looking at going on the road to Penn State. I don't know about you. I want to get your thoughts on Penn State as we flip over to them in just a few minutes here. I think Penn State could be a close game actually for them in some ways, could potentially be, especially on the road, played in that environment. But outside of that, Michigan isn't competitive this year on the same level as Ohio State. I think we can both agree. And I think Ohio State will be just fine. It's got to be gut wrenching for Ohio State fans to lose another game like that in the final minutes when Ryan Day, like you said, and I like the point that you bring up in caving to outside pressure, because I think a lot of this offseason was a lot of that too. A lot of the moves that they made were in direct relation to some of the criticism there had been of him. And I pay some attention to Ohio State circles and the media and everything. It was interesting to me, hiring Chip Kelly to be the offensive coordinator, because a lot of the criticism from Ohio State media had been Day's trying to do too much. He's got too much on his plate as OC and head coach. And just want to get a final thought on this game from you. Do you think that makes him even more culpable in this game now that he's just the head coach and he should be making those, kind of game theory decisions, perhaps better late in game now?
That's something that I haven't thought of before, but probably, especially since this is now year 3 in a row where there have been questionable game management. I don't think that last year's game against Michigan, for example, was managed poorly. In fact, I think that Ohio State was somewhat not lucky, not fortunate, but Michigan statistically should have won that game by 6 more points. Like, Ohio State played one of their best games of the year. Their O-line stepped up. Michigan was just that much of a better team with home field advantage. Like, they were going to win that game closer to 9 or 10 times out of 10 than not. But against Penn State last year, going for it on 4th and goal when you just need to kick the field goal, or running the ball 40 times for 2 yards per carry when you have Marvin Harrison Jr., or in 2022, we all know about some of the stuff against Michigan, not going for it, not being aggressive. Against Georgia. Obviously that whole debacle at the end of the game, although I thought Day did a pretty good job in that game. I don't think that he should be criticized for that.
The Georgia game was merely a missed field goal. I mean, at least in that game, he had them set up for the attempt. The attempt failed. And
the bigger thing in that game is they were dominating Georgia, or at least controlling them for 3 quarters. And then they didn't quit, but they were outscored by like 15 points in the 4th quarter. And that's something that you just can't have. But I want to get back to, before we move on, the final few seconds of the game and then the defense. I predicted that Ohio State would win 31-20 over Oregon. And Ohio State scored 31 points. They didn't run the ball like I thought they would. And Will Howard was the reason why they were in the game, why they were winning, and I didn't think he would be. But I got 31 points correct because I thought that Igbuka and Smith would do well. And I thought that they would do something on the ground. And in total, they did. Although, as the game went on, of course, that faded away. What I didn't expect was their defense looking as stale and as ineffective as it did. It was like with Evan Stewart or Trayshawn Holden before he made one of the most idiotic decisions ever and got himself suspended.
Oh, that was boneheaded.
Johnson.
Yeah.
They were getting behind the defense all the time. This was along with Iowa's when Cooper DeJean was healthy, bless you, And
Thanks.
with Michigan's, this was one of the best secondaries in the country last year.
Mm-hmm.
And unlike Iowa and Michigan, they didn't lose. I mean, they lost Josh Proctor, but I don't think any of us would have viewed him.
He wasn't a major contributor.
Especially, with Caleb Downs coming in, as
Right.
losing what Michigan lost or Iowa lost.
Yeah.
And that secondary looked bad.
I mean,
struggled to tackle.
Denzel Burke gave up over 100, I think, himself.
Yes, he
Yeah.
did. And Igmanosin got targeted, and they struggled to tackle throughout the
Yeah.
whole game. Like Oregon was getting yards after contact.
Mhm.
Like the physicality wasn't purely dominance in the trenches. It was physicality by inches in the trenches, by inches on the perimeter,
Yeah.
and also by inches at quarterback. I
Mhm.
think that Gabriel did more on the ground and was the tougher quarterback in this game, just by a little bit though. And then in that final 30 seconds, why are you passing? To me, that was criminal. That was malfeasance. That was bad. Why are you passing? You run. You have the best running back duo in America. Oregon is probably going to expect you to pass the football. I don't know. I think they only brought like maybe 4 or 5 guys. I don't remember that exact play when they threw it for the end zone and it missed.
Yeah.
And you have a timeout, and Oregon is 3.
Timeout. Oh my gosh. The fact that you had a timeout in your pocket.
I don't think Ohio State had a timeout against Georgia when they did.
No.
I could be.
I don't think I think they were able to run they had the ball in this game on, what was it, the Oregon 28 or 30, somewhere in there. And granted, it's college football, so you want to be a little closer to really make sure you're giving your kicker a great chance. And I actually thought Joel Klatt on his podcast today did a really good kind of review of this. But one more thing on this game too, since we're kind of on the final seconds of the game, do you think Dan Lanning intentionally sent 12 men on the field on one of those final plays? What are your thoughts on that? Or have you seen that call and heard about that?
With hindsight, I do. Before I listened to some things this morning, I thought it was kind of like maybe he did, maybe he didn't, or I don't know. He absolutely called the onside kick though. And that was really, that was another moment where you could take that and view it as the epitome of the game and you wouldn't be wrong. Oregon was that much more tactical and cerebral than Ohio State. Ohio State's game plan throughout the game evolved to throw it to Igbuka and Smith because no one except for generational DBs can cover them.
Yeah.
That's really what the game evolved
that kind
into.
of, the funny thing is kind of like the more Ohio State has changed, the more they've kind of stayed the same too, right? And then who is it? I think it's Devin Gardner says this often, and it's so true. In crunch time, people always revert back to who they truly are, right? And Ohio State found themselves in crunch time, and Ryan Day reverted back as a coach and coordinator. And maybe this was Chip Kelly too, and we'll never really know who was really, influencing a lot of the tactical decisions later in the game, but they reverted back to being a pass first team. And I think it's interesting because that is Day's bread and butter. That's what got him the job as the offensive coordinator at Ohio State. Was Urban Meyer needed a kind of schematic change because, teams were kind of catching up to him in the meta game. And he went with this kind of NFL style, slinging the ball all over the field coordinator in Ryan Day. And it's honestly, looking back on it now, and I'm just kind of thinking about this for the first time, it's not really surprising that he went back to that. But yeah, it's really interesting. Great game. I'm sure we could talk about it all night, but unfortunately we have to move on here. I do want to get to a super chat real quick from Nick. Y'all studs must have woman fans drooling over you. Well, I have one woman fan. That is my wife, and I'm pretty sure she's the only woman in this world that finds me that attractive. So I'm really thankful for her. If you guys want to drop your super chats and stuff, feel free to get them in, and we will answer to them in kind. And we will move on, of course. It's one of my first few times doing this, to Penn State, USC. Penn State outscores USC in this one 24-10 in the second half after, again, I think they were down by 14 at half, if I remember right. Despite 3 turnovers, which is very uncharacteristic of Drew Aller, all 3 of those interceptions, of course, Penn State comes back to win this one in overtime. And once again, we've kind of been covering it on my channel. Sam, I don't know if you've really paid attention to it. Miller Moss down the stretch has not been too good. In this one in the fourth quarter, 6 of 11 with an interception on that last drive, of course, and a touchdown. USC just 2 of 11 on third down in this game as well. Sam, what are your kind of overarching thoughts on this game?
You said 6 of 11 in the fourth quarter.
6 of 11 with a touchdown. Did have a touchdown in the fourth quarter, and of course had the INT to seal the game for Penn State, which was a big overthrow by Miller Moss.
He's worse than Spencer Rattler. That's horrible.
Man,
he's right.
I didn't know you had these hot takes on Miller Moss. This is interesting.
I've felt that way for a few games now, because in the Michigan game, for example, Wink Martindale's scheme is words can't describe how frustrating it is and how out of date it is. And I
agree wholeheartedly as a Michigan fan.
He did well in the second half, but he also had some pretty bad. Like in that game, I thought to myself, I don't think that's a Lincoln Riley quarterback. And then against Minnesota, oh no. Yeah. And here it kind of came up that way too. Although I will say, I think USC played their best game of the year against Penn State. And the painful thing, if you're a USC fan, is you had the A+ performance, you played to your ceiling. Penn State probably had a B game, maybe even worse, and they beat you because Penn State's that good. And USC
Penn State
just is not.
Yeah, and Penn State managed to buck the trend, by the way. Coming into that game, teams traveling out to the West Coast, or teams generally traveling the 3 time zones it's required to go to the Midwest or out West, were like 1-8 so far this season. Penn State bucks the trend. And yeah, I don't know about you. Maybe we can kind of cover just Penn State generally for a second, but Penn State is a great team this year, in my opinion. I really like the addition of Andy Kotelnicki. I liked it at the time. I think he's a very, very brilliant offensive coordinator. Dare I say it, I even put him almost up there on that pedestal with like a Ben Johnson at the Lions, which I know might sound a little sacrilege to some people, especially Lions fans out there, because he is doing a great job at the NFL level. But just the creativity, the comfortability that it looks like Aller is playing with. And Drew Aller also is playing pretty damn great, despite the 3 interceptions in this one, which was very uncharacteristic of him. 391 yards, nearly 400 yards, 69%, a 9.1 yards per attempt average in this game, which is still much higher than what he's had in previous seasons. My critique of him was last year's team was very dink and dunk, and I didn't think they really trusted him, very much either. But he's really performed well. Penn State also, by the way, speaking of Drew Eller, they had only 118 rushing yards on 31 carries in this game. So they really had to lean on Aller on the road in a tough environment, though I'd say USC isn't entirely that tough of an environment. Can you fill up your stadium for one game at least?
I mean, it was loud. I could tell through the TV. It was.
Yeah. I mean, their band
showed up.
Their band plays Fight On after every down, so that's some noise.
Man, I follow a USC channel called the Trojan Blade, and I honestly feel bad for him. Like you can feel the pain in his voice, because they've had 3 close losses, games they could have won, and they just didn't.
They just can't close out. And
I mean, James Franklin outcoached Lincoln Riley. That has to be humiliating.
Yeah,
because this is an interesting stat, and I did this because I decided to look at FPI through the past decade. This was the first time since 2016 where Penn State had a comeback win, like down double digits, down 2 touchdowns exactly, against a top 15 team in FPI when they came back against Wisconsin in the Big Ten championship game. I don't know about you or viewers here, and a lot of my subscriber base doesn't necessarily agree. I think this Penn State team is different, and I like what you said about Kotelnicki. I think he's the best offensive coordinator in the country, and I like what you mentioned about Aller, because they struggled to run the football, and they relied on him. And outside of really those 2 bad decisions, because the 3rd interception was a Hail Mary, didn't really mean all that much. He delivered. I mean, those fourth down conversion plays were clutch. Those were perfect. You couldn't have executed from his standpoint any better than that. And as Hummus Hero, how have you been? He commented a lot on my channel. I don't know if he's still subscribed or what, or if he's still on and I just haven't caught wind of him. But it's nice to see you on here. It's been a while.
I
But
think
anyway,
Hummus Hero is a staple over here, voice of college football. It's good to see you.
yeah, 4-8 in last 12 games.
Yeah, pretty bad.
Yeah. And
you
then,
have to think that Lincoln Riley is close, if not already solidly on the hot seat. I mean, 7-5 was it last season with the Heisman quarterback. You have another. I still think Miller Moss can be a great college quarterback. I came in this season thinking he was going to be near elite, especially that with that performance against Louisville in the bowl game. I was really high on him. I thought he would fit the role a little bit better than Caleb Williams because he was more of just a pocket guy who kind of wanted to operate the system the way Lincoln calls it. And I still see it, running the offense running well, but when it's only when everything is humming just right is a Lincoln Riley team doing great. They're the least resilient teams, going back all the way to his Oklahoma days, least resilient teams in all of college football. Time after time, those Oklahoma teams would make the playoff or they'd be in a big game and they would just shatter. And that's what I saw. That's what I saw in the Michigan game down the stretch. That's what I saw, against Penn State here. There's just no resiliency. And I also have to wonder too, the move to D'Anton Lynn as defensive coordinator, I thought was a great hire.
It is.
But I'm also kind of prognosticating this too, because I think a lot on like game theory, like metagame stuff. I'm a giant nerd outside of this. I actually play a shit ton of Magic the Gathering and stuff outside of this. So I'm always thinking about these things. But with Wink Martindale's defense struggling, and with D'Anton Lynn taking his scheme to USC and now having some issues, and other defensive coordinators and analysts around the country kind of adopting different iterations of that amoeba defense, I kind of wonder if some of the offensive schemes are kind of catching up to that style of defense too, as well, because Aller was able to pretty effectively, again, outside of those interceptions, pick apart this defense in this game. And that defense is supposed to be built to slow down a passing attack. So kind of want your thoughts on that real quick too, as well.
I didn't think of that. And part of me disagrees, but what I will say is Kotelnicki's so good that, I mean, you kind of hit me with a curveball there, which I like, because I didn't.
That's what I do best.
I didn't think of that. That's something I'll have to think on. What I will say is, like, with the trick play where they scored a touchdown at a halftime, that was USC. That was USC not having the right player. They could have made a play, and just because it was Warren against a safety who probably isn't like, I don't know, like he's not Ed Reed. Well, you're cooked. And then there were some, I don't know. I've always thought this year, and I could be wrong, that it was purely personnel, that Grinch ruined the defense so badly, and USC, well, they had to use the portal. And when you bank on using the portal, you're not going to hit it off unless you're using them to supplement your existing talent, like Oregon, for example, or Ohio State. Ohio State and Oregon's current issues, because no, they're not perfect teams, they're probably not greatest of all time caliber teams, are issues they already had entering this year. It's not because their portal players are busting. For USC here, their foundation was already very shaky, and Lincoln Riley made a hard reset by hiring the defensive staff that he did, and they lost a ton on offense. They've improved a lot on defense, like the fact that they were able to limit Penn State's ground attack, force some turnovers, the fact that they're much better. But I think that they don't have a Lincoln Riley offense either. Like their defense has improved, and then the offense has offset that by equally regressing. I mean,
that is a really good point, because sorry to interrupt you, but
you're good.
Their SP Plus rankings defensively, they're 62nd right now, which is far improved from Alex Grinch days where they were down in the hundreds. But to your point, I actually talked about this on my channel the other day. They're only 9th in offensive SP plus, which doesn't sound too terribly bad at all. And I'd be curious to look back on it. That feels like the first time I've seen a Lincoln Riley offense outside of the top 5 in SP plus offense in a while.
It's going to get worse because S&P Plus wisely uses priors. That's why Michigan's still top 25 there. In reality, it's probably outside of the top 15 offensively. ESPN's efficiency metrics, they have USC. Oh my gosh, it's bad for Lincoln Riley. 24th in offensive efficiency. And that's, I mean, when Penn State's the best defense they played, and they've had games against Minnesota and Michigan and LSU where, I mean, and none of those defenses are bad by any means, but they're not. I don't know. My read on USC since the preseason's been very shaky. You may know more about USC than I do. That wouldn't shock me at all, like one bit, because my read on them has been, I mean, shockingly, I've been kind of right. In the preseason, I had them 2-4 in their first 6 games, and they're 3-3. And I had them losing to Minnesota in the preseason. I picked them losing to Minnesota the week of, and it happened because I don't think personnel-wise they were ready. Like Oregon, like you mentioned, Oregon's ready for the Big Ten. It's just a question of, are they going to harness what they have?
Yeah.
USC can scheme all they want, but Grinch and Riley ruined the roster so badly that I don't think it would matter all that much in year one. But what you said about the scheme, the amoeba defense, I really like that. And I need to think about that because I don't know. I mean, you want to dive into more of a detail about like what you mean about that? I'd be curious.
Well, it's just the basic theory of like, if you stay stagnant and stick to a very particular scheme and your set of plays, it can be really, really good. Like Jesse Minter's defense last season was just chef's kiss. Great. Like one of the all-time great defenses. That's borne out in all the metrics. And you saw all the players that got drafted to the NFL. But if you just stick to that same thing for so long, other teams are out here to beat you. Other teams are out here to compete with you. Eventually somebody's going to figure you out and have the kind of code to crack it, right? I don't know if you play the game, but I play a ton of Magic the Gathering. And it's a game where you build a deck of cards and you play kind of like Yu-Gi-Oh! Or something like that. And people are always figuring this out. You build a great deck that can win a tournament, and the next thing you know, somebody figures out exactly what you're doing, and they have the answer to that in their whatever they build to kind of give the answer to that, right? It's basic game theory, meta game kind of stuff, right? So my theory is that we saw this with like, it's the whole progression of the game to go back through the history, right? The wing T offense bore out the birth of the linebacker position, which was the answer to, you know, all of that inverted veer and stuff that players were running back in the day. And then if you want a more modern version of that, everyone got obsessed with the spread offense for a period of time. It was what everybody was running. Everyone was running up tempo. Everyone was trying to tire out other defenses and keep them from subbing and attack spaces instead of making blocks. Defenses caught up to that. And now we're actually kind of, one thing I've been covering on my channels, we're kind of getting back to a lot of physical football, by the way. In case you didn't notice it, 3 out of the 4 teams that made the college football playoff last season were teams that featured H-backs for like the first time in a long time. Alabama and Michigan were running H-backs. They were running more wing T style formations. And that's because when the metagame kind of shifts, you have to adapt, right? And I wonder, just from kind of like a really broad view, if with guys like Kotelnicki kind of figuring out how to attack this amoeba defense, that we're maybe seeing, and especially what's going on with Wink Martindale. But I do think, like you said, Wink Martindale runs a very basic version of what Jesse Minter and Mike McDonald were running. Those were the guys that kind of built off of his like base scheme, if you will. And I think the problem for Michigan is they've kind of reverted back to that basic stuff, and that's not working entirely well, especially when you're blitzing. Don't ever blitz Makari Page again. Just don't. He's not a blitzer. He spent like the last 3 seasons not even on the screen for a reason. He's back 15 yards. But anyway, I just think it's interesting. It's the kind of stuff I think about often, because I don't think, like we've talked about so far in this live stream. And again, I appreciate you coming on because I really like these in-depth conversations. football comes down to basically like three things: your scheme and your base philosophy, the physicality you're able to play with, because no matter how well you scheme, you still got to block, you still got to tackle, and in-game coaching decisions. And scheme is a big part of it. It's like 30% of the formula that it's laid out there. So I do think it's really interesting. It would be really, really bad for USC fans if I'm right, because that shift to D'Anton Lynn may have come a little too late in the game. But yeah, USC giving up 391 yards to a quarterback that doesn't often throw that much. Pretty bad in this one. And by the way, we got to shout out Tyler Warren. 17 receptions for 224 yards and a touchdown in this one. I believe he broke some kind of record for receiving touchdowns by a tight end. I don't know if that was a Penn State record or a Big Ten record or what, but crazy game by Tyler Warren too.
Yeah. Really, really good performance. Definitely first team All-American at tight end.
Yeah.
And thank you for explaining that. That's very, it's very helpful. I think that what you said actually may more apply to the offensive side of the ball, because I think that, and part of it's the offensive line. USC's offensive line it's a mess. But Riley is not. I don't know if it's a Zachariah Branch issue or if it's a him as in Riley issue. They don't know how to utilize the talent they have. I mean, that could be a receiver core that, if properly schemed and coached, and I think it's well coached, but if properly schemed, I don't know who could stop that passing offense.
That receiver core should be like the third best in this conference behind Ohio State and Oregon, and maybe even right there with Oregon. I don't know how you feel about that, but
yeah, I mean, numerically, statistically, absolutely not. But in terms of talent, and it's impressive because all of them are basically sophomores with some juniors. They should be that good, but they're not. And whether it's Miller Moss, whether it's the offensive line not giving them protection, or Lincoln Riley, at USC, every year at USC, he has passed the ball more than ran the ball. The pass percentage is over 50% of all of the plays. That is completely uncharacteristic of any of his offenses at Oklahoma, where he ran the football more and ran it very well. They averaged like 8 yards per carry in 2018 with Kyler Murray, and I forget who the running back was then. But they haven't done that at USC. They've kind of deviated a little bit away from the run, went more pass heavy. Defensively, they were even worse than they were at Oklahoma. The offensive line outside of his first year there hasn't been the same. And if you're right about it defensively, I think that analogy may actually totally fit offensively, but it could defensively, because I have a lot to learn with scheme and stuff. I never played the sport. If you're right there, well, the loss to Penn State may have been the funeral procession for Lincoln Riley, because it's not going to get easier.
Yeah. Oh, it's not. And their schedule,
they got to play Notre Dame.
They got to play Notre Dame. Nebraska's faded, I would say.
Yeah, but Nebraska could beat them. Nebraska could have 6 sacks, and if Raiola plays a good game, I don't see how USC's defense will hold them to less than the mid upper 20s.
And again, that Nebraska defense, even that secondary, is pretty good. Rutgers, Kyle Monangai at Washington, which Washington is probably the most intriguing team in the conference to me. They're a team that seems to always shoot themselves in the foot. That Iowa game probably could have been a little closer. But I know we have limited time with you here tonight. We got about 15 minutes left. I do want to get into that Washington-Iowa game, by the way, just to kind of segue there. Unless you got something else you want to say real quick.
One more thing. It's a question that's Penn State related. Penn State versus Ohio State in a few weeks.
Ooh.
Do you think that Penn State has, let's say, a coin flip chance to win? Like, not just a chance, because they've always had a chance, but like a legitimate shot to break through and win.
It's really tough.
Big.
That's really tough because this team is there's so much cohesion offensively. Like they all 11 players know exactly what they're doing on any given play, and all 11 players on that Penn State offense are invested in running the football effectively, which is a big thing. I mean, even Drew Aller on some cutbacks and stuff is throwing blocks. I'm gonna go out on a limb. I'm gonna say right now, I'm honestly leaning towards like a 55% chance Penn State, and I'll give you the reason why real quick. Going off a scheme and stuff here. Jim Knowles, and we saw this in the Oregon game the other night. Jim Knowles really likes to stay in that. It's not really nickel, but he plays with kind of like 3 true safeties on the field a lot. And that's obviously an answer to the modern day college football game where teams are throwing the ball all over the yard, right? Penn State will run the ball down their throat all day with Tyler Warren in his H-back, in those wing T kind of formations, in those T formations with both running backs in the backfield. Now, I don't know is it Singleton or Aller that's injured and dealing with something right now. I don't know if they'll both be in that game. Singleton. So, but Penn State also has wide receivers for the first time. And it seems like every game there's a different one that's stepping up too, whether it's that Amari Evans kid or Julian Fleming had some great catches in this game against USC, the Ohio State transfer. So Penn State, what they do schematically to me is the most interesting thing in the game offensively, because they will run 2 tight ends. They'll run 22 personnel, and they will get Jim Knowles out of his base defense. And that's not the Ohio State defense with all the best 11 players on the field, because you're taking out a Jordan Hancock or somebody like that and subbing in. The linebackers on Ohio State's defense are really good, but they're not as experienced as the rest of the players on the defense. So that's a really interesting schematic matchup to me. And Kotelnicki will pull out everything in this game, I think, too. We saw Tyler Warren came in as a center on one play against USC and then ended up catching the 37-yard touchdown or whatever it was. I mean, it could be a really interesting one. It could be really interesting. I will say that. Ohio State is still the best roster in college football. They're still uber talented, and I don't know if the Tom Allen Penn State defense is better equipped to handle Ohio State than what Manny Diaz's were. So on that side of the ball, I'm iffy, but I really like Penn State going in that game from an offensive standpoint, I will say.
Thank you. That's kind of what I'm thinking. I honestly liked Ohio State more in what they did against Oregon than what Penn State did against USC. But I made the prediction in about August where I thought that Penn State would pull it off for the first time since 2016. And I have not seen enough to necessarily deviate away from that. I haven't. I mean, especially with how Penn State beat USC, I don't know if they have the same ceiling that I thought they would have. But now I know for a fact they have they have some resiliency, because if they just went in there and blew them out, I mean, maybe they wouldn't need resiliency, but we wouldn't exactly know. But I think we know now this team has a little bit of a different gear. Franklin's very coordinator dependent. Luckily, I think he has an elite staff. Defensively, Penn State plays pretty bend but don't break, which is kind of the opposite of what Diaz like to do, where it's all or nothing.
Yeah.
So I think Ohio State will be able to score points because they did against Oregon. But against Ohio State, I'd rather go bend but don't break than all or nothing, because they have the athletes to make you pay in all or nothing. And that's what they've done to any defense that does that. But bend but don't break, you force them to be slow, you force them to be methodical, you force them to think and to have endurance. And like you said, with their 2 tight ends and with their receivers stepping up and all of that, with it being in Happy Valley, I would, that's why I asked the question, because in my mind, when I see people say, who are the best teams in the country, or who's your top 4, top 5, and no one except for the polls, for whatever reason, are listing Penn State, or everyone's saying, well, Ohio State will see Oregon and Indy, with no mention of the Penn State game. It's interesting.
It's crazy how overlooked it's getting. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not an automatic win. It's
No, not
not.
at
I
all.
mean, last year's game, if Franklin doesn't abandon the run after the first quarter, they may have beaten that team in Columbus. They
Mhm.
didn't, but they averaged like 2 more yards per carry, factoring out sacks, than Ohio State did. They just completely abandoned the run for reasons that I don't know, but
Yeah, it
they
was
did.
wild. Yeah, and it's good bringing it up too. The last couple of years were much closer than people give it credit for. I think it's just a lot of I don't want to call it lazy or anything, but it's kind of the kind of basic heuristics we rely on as college football fans. We think in kind of short terms of what do we see on a year in year out basis from each team, and the gag, the joke about Penn State coming into the season is they're a perennial 10-2 team. You know, they can't beat Michigan, they can't beat Ohio State, but that was, speaking of Michigan, that was the thing about Michigan coming into 2021, right? And things can change. And
Yep.
similar to Jim Harbaugh coming out of the COVID year, James Franklin has completely overhauled his staff. They've overhauled their personnel in some ways. They got AJ Harris in the transfer portal, the corner, who had a big interception a couple of games ago against, I think it was against Illinois. So yeah, I really think that there's, for the first time, there's an interesting schematic matchup there. And I like that you bring up the defense, because Tom Allen's defense, I think, is more equipped for at least slowing down Ohio State. And it's got to be the Mike McDonald 2021 Michigan kind of game plan in a way, where you kind of keep the lid on the offense, make them drive the field, try to get field goals instead of touchdowns in terms of stopping Ohio State. But then you look at quarterback, and again, like we talked about, Drew Aller's playing really great. I think he's in the top 5 in completion percentage or pass efficiency or one of those metrics so far this season.
Oh,
And
yeah.
he's throwing the ball further down the field. So they're throwing the ball further down the field. They're getting more yards per attempt, and the completion percentage hasn't dropped off.
Yeah. And that's kind of when I watch that Oregon game where I'm thinking Gabriel's better receivers, but Aller has a stronger arm and he has more upside. And if Gabriel could fling that ball deep, and if his receivers could get behind Ohio State's DBs,
Yeah.
like if Penn State can do that with the rushing offense that has looked disappointing in the past 2 games,
It
but we
has
know that it
been
has a
challenged.
ceiling.
Yeah.
If he can do that, that's not going to be good, because Jim
Mhm.
Knowles, whether it's last year or this year, ever since that 2022 year, I have basically only seen them bring 4 guys forward, if less.
Mhm.
They're very conservative,
Yeah.
very bend but don't break. And for whatever reason, against Oregon, it didn't, like, they bend but don't break, and they broke nearly every time outside of that 4th and goal, which was
Yeah.
still schemed properly. Gabriel just didn't see his receiver. So
Mhm.
based off of how things are going right now, I don't know if I'd straight up favor Penn State, but I've seen nothing to change my opinion from the preseason that Penn State would pull off an upset.
Yeah, no, that's really good insight on that matchup coming up. I guess maybe if you're willing, we'll have to have you on again, maybe to preview that in a few weeks. But
I'd love to.
awesome. Yeah. So do you want to get into Washington, Iowa with you briefly before I know you have to go here in a few minutes? And really excited to have you on, by the way. Thank you again for coming on with us. By the way, to the audience out there, in case you're unfamiliar, College Football with Sam is a great channel. You should go check it out if you haven't seen it already. Honestly, one of the inspirations for me starting my channel over at Darren Talks Ball, so really cool to have you on. Washington,
Thank you for having
Iowa.
me on.
Yeah, yeah. Washington, Iowa. I really felt like Washington had turned a corner in that Michigan game. They didn't commit all the dumb penalties. They didn't do the things in the red zone that kind of caused them to shoot themselves in the foot. They missed a field goal or had a field goal blocked in that Michigan game, but I felt like the special teams were better. So I really thought Washington was turning a corner. I had predicted that Washington would win this game on the road in Iowa City, and boy, was I wrong. And despite Iowa losing the time of possession battle by 10 minutes, despite them having fewer yards gained, they lost the yards battle 393 to 328. And despite fewer first downs, they managed to pull off the win 40 to 16. Sam, what are your kind of overarching thoughts on both Iowa and Washington after this game?
I picked Iowa to win 27-13, and I thought that Washington would outgain Iowa in yards, and they did. It was worse than I thought because it was 40-10 with over
Yeah,
half of the fourth quarter left. I mean,
that's
that
a good
was
point. The 6 points at the end was yeah,
it was disgusting. I
yeah.
mean, for me it was beautiful, but like for Washington, you have to be disgusted because
Mhm.
Iowa, look, I mean, they held Will Rogers to his worst game of the season, and I think that Iowa's defense is legit. And I think what I said entering the Ohio State game when Iowa played them rang true, that a lot of those long passes were kind of a bit fluky and that they would figure
Mm.
things out. And Phil Parker's done that. I mean, this defense is it's one of the nation's best, and Washington's offense is better than I thought it would be in the preseason because Will Rogers at Mississippi State hasn't been playing as good as he
Yeah.
has been at Washington. And Jonah Coleman's been awesome for
Mhm.
them. And same with Damon Williams Jr., their backup, who's
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
played pretty well as
Mhm.
a youngster.
Mhm.
Washington ran 80 plays to Iowa's, 80 plays to 51. And
Jeez.
Iowa killed
Mhm.
it's efficiency monster type stuff. Iowa is a team that doesn't shoot themselves in the foot outside of maybe occasionally in the passing offense. They run the ball extremely well. I mean, it was another game where Caleb Johnson averaged over 6 yards per carry, 2 touchdowns, 166 yards. If not for Ashton Jeanty, he'd be given accolades because he has
Yeah.
937 yards, 12
Mhm.
touchdowns. This is all through 4 games. So
I think
assuming
he's second or third in yards per carry in the country too,
it's
behind only
insane,
Jinty and
he'll
yeah.
get over 1,500 and probably over 20
Yeah.
rushing touchdowns because
Yeah.
imagine what Iowa will do to UCLA.
Oh,
Imagine what
yeah.
they are going to do to Wisconsin. I know Wisconsin looked better against Rutgers running, like stopping the run, but I think Rutgers may have some issues like
Mhm.
everywhere after Wisconsin splattered them on
Oh,
their own
yeah.
home field.
Yeah, that
That was
was oof,
that
rough.
was a game I wanted to review. Maybe I'll
Mhm.
get to it this week in like a Rutgers or Wisconsin specific video. I didn't have the time for it today, but that was so bad. I couldn't believe what I was watching,
Mhm.
especially when you factored in that like Nebraska only beat Rutgers by 7, and then Wisconsin just marches in, and you have Braden Locke like
Yeah.
flinging it and beating.
Crazy too.
What
Yeah.
are you doing?
It looked like that first half of the USC game all over again for a while. It was crazy. Oh,
Yeah,
Wisconsin, if only they could have closed out, that would have been yeah, but yeah, Washington, once again, like you said, time of possession, running 80 plays. And how good is Iowa's defense when they're on the field for that long, for that many plays, and they still only realistically only really give up 10 points? Because I think we can agree that 6 right towards the end of the game was, I wouldn't say fluky, and all points do count, right? And I don't like to be the one to use the outlier analogy, because as someone with a research degree, the way people use the term outlier in college football analysis is not actually accurate, but that's for another time and place. But just absolutely dominant. The defense ended up, by the way, with 4 sacks, 5 tackles for loss, an interception, and a fumble recovery. And the interesting thing to me too was Washington, in all their possessions, all the plays they had, they only punted once in this game. Only once. They were 3 for 6 on fourth down, and then they missed a field goal, and of course had the turnovers. So very typical of Washington this season. Gain a ton of yards, have a ton of time of possession, and do absolutely nothing with it. Just craziness. I mean, they went right back to the team they were against Rutgers a few weeks ago.
yeah. Um, I think for Washington, it's just get to a bowl game, build on what you have. For Iowa, it's win out. And if there's enough chaos, maybe you can get to the playoff, and then Ferentz will be hailed as like a hero.
Mhm.
Or get to Indy, because in all honesty, um, well, with Oregon and the schedule they have, Oregon's probably going to go there anyway. Like
Probably.
Iowa probably doesn't have a chance to win the Big Ten, but like at least get to a spot where you're going
Yeah.
to probably get blown out again, because
Well,
that shows that you're hitting your ceiling. Um,
yeah. Well, the interesting thing with Iowa is if you look at their schedule now, down the line. I don't have it pulled up here, but all the rest of their games are winnable. I think
Oh,
their
yeah.
toughest matchups are like, do they play Wisconsin still? I
They
know they
play
play
Wisconsin, but it's
Nebraska.
at home, and it's
It's
the
at
same
home.
thing with Nebraska. Their
They get both
toughest
their toughest
game.
games at home, and then you look at their losses, and they've only lost to Ohio State, which we agree is one of the best teams in the country still, and Iowa State, who is like 11th now in the country, 6-0,
Yeah.
looking really
Actually, I
good.
think they're
So
ninth.
ninth
They moved
now?
up top
Okay.
10,
Wow. So
which means if you're Iowa and you beat them, you'd be ranked.
you would be, yeah.
You'd be in
But
the playoff race.
a 10-2 Big Ten team with Iowa's strength of record there, with those 2 losses being your only ones, it would depend a lot, I know, on how the rest of the conferences, the rest of the country looks, like teams like Ole Miss and et cetera, wherever they finish. But I think a 10-2 Iowa team with only those 2 losses could make a great argument for the playoff.
Yeah, I think so. I, I think what you said there is really good. Something else I've said, I think, for a week or maybe 2 that I believe that Iowa is a better version of Michigan.
Ooh,
And I
yeah,
think the game against Washington showed that. Like
yeah,
if Michigan was better coached and if they were better able to utilize their strengths and had better schemes, they'd look like a probably more athletic version of Iowa, like what Iowa
yeah.
looks like right now. But instead, yeah, I mean that Michigan versus Washington game, some people said, "Oh, like it's bad, but Washington's a good team." And I said immediately after that game, like, no, season's over. I mean, Washington is not this
Mhm.
top 25 team.
Not
And I
powerhouse.
think you saw that against Iowa, where Iowa really, you know, ran for 8 yards per carry. They had 2 passing touchdowns. They could have had a third if McNamara was more accurate. And
Mhm.
yeah,
Those were McNamara's first passing touchdowns against a Power 4 team and since 2021, I think that way. So
wow,
that's a fun stat there that I
that's
heard earlier today.
that is very
Yeah.
entertaining.
Well, I know you gotta get going really soon, but real quick before you go, I gotta wrap up as well early, it turns out, too, for everyone watching, but I do wanna get your thoughts. We're both Michigan fans. So real quick, give me your thoughts on Michigan this season and what you've seen.
Oh boy. Well, I'm probably going to cover this week, but no promises. Just in case, though, you should visit the channel. Michigan has been very disappointing this year. Very, very disappointing. And I
Mhm.
know they lost a lot, their coaching staff, their roster. But you bring back some first rounders. The offensive line's well recruited. Tight end, you have a first rounder. The running back room is clearly good. And your special teams are really good too, at least at kicker. Like
Savada, one of the best in the country. Yeah.
all that was missing was maybe an additional wide receiver or 2 in the portal, better
Mhm.
quarterback in the portal. And that's all that was missing roster wise. But the biggest issue with Michigan has been they're highly penalized. They are worse at tackling, which to regress that much in tackling with players who were tackling well last year tells me that there's something off with coaching, like
Yeah.
not just coordinators, but position coaches.
Yeah, good point.
And it, it from a Michigan fan standpoint, obviously disappointing,
Yeah.
but from an analyst standpoint, it's almost even more disappointing
Yeah.
for the reason being that you watch the Ohio State Oregon game and you realize that Ohio State may not be as physical as advertised in the first 5 games. That like someone with a Michigan rushing offense of the previous few seasons or Oregon or Penn State, if they're operating at their peak running the football, could run on them, could kind of dictate the pace and if not the pace or TOP, the philosophy of the
Mhm.
game
Mhm.
dictate that.
Oh, yeah, the terms of the game, really.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a better way of putting it.
Yeah.
Thank you. And if 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 Michigan had like their 2021 team teleported this to this season, I don't think they beat Texas because I think Texas is that well rounded and
Yeah.
they may have the best O line in the country. And it was early. And
Mhm.
Michigan in 2021 earlier in the year was not as good as they were later in the year. But anyway,
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
you would have beaten Washington. You would have had a much better shot against Oregon because you actually would have had receivers, a much better O-line, a much better defense, coordinator-wise. And even against Ohio State, I mean, I think 2021 Michigan would have a chance. 2022 and 3 obviously would.
Mhm.
Um, if not, and this is subjective, but I think it's a down year in football. I think those teams, along with, the
Yeah.
Georgia teams the previous few seasons and some other teams could win this Big Ten. They could. And the fact that Michigan had the talent to be able to do that, and they're this poorly coached, they look completely
Mhm.
disheveled. Their quarterback play is amongst the worst in the Big Ten. They don't even have a receiver, like wide receiver, not tight end, wide receiver who's hit 100 receiving yards. It's not good. This is a
Yeah.
wasted this was a wasted opportunity to
Mhm.
like build on the previous 3 years success. It was. And I hope
Yeah.
Sharon Moore's the guy, but the Illinois game will tell us a lot. And Wink
Oh, for sure.
Martindale can't he can't come back.
Mhm.
Even if the defense somehow completely rights the ship, he
Mhm.
can't come back next year. And I don't know if
You're
Kirk
already
Campbell
done
can
with
either.
Wink. You're already done with Wink, huh?
Yeah. No,
Okay.
it's
I mean, I'm pretty much right there with you. I just haven't jumped off the ledge yet, but yeah.
with the talent that they have to look like they did against Texas, to look like they did against Washington, against Minnesota late, against USC for most of the third quarter, early fourth, it's bad.
Mhm.
It's, I mean, the last 3 Michigan defenses, I think Texas again would have beaten 21 Michigan, maybe 22 in their own stadium, because I do, if there's one team this season who resembles the 4-team playoff champions, it's Texas. It's not really anyone else at this
Yeah.
point. Texas, maybe OSU, PSU, and Oregon. Um, Definitely Texas. Outside of those 4, I wouldn't say anyone else. I think Georgia kind of looks a little bit off. And Alabama's a Caitlin DeBoer team. They
Yeah.
look like Washington of last year, but
It's
they don't
crazy how
quite
much that.
have
Yeah.
the receivers or the quarterback to do what they want to do.
Mhm.
They're going to
No, that
play in a
makes a
bunch
lot
of
of
close
sense.
games,
Yeah.
probably win most of them. Maybe they can make a playoff run, but with what they have right now, I wouldn't pick them to beat the top 3 Big Ten teams. But anyway, I don't want to ramble too much because
No,
I know
you're
you
good.
have to go
You're good.
and I have to go.
No,
But it has been no matter how bad you think it is, unless maybe you're a Michigan fan, but from an outside opinion, if you're not a Michigan fan, even the Ohio State fans who are saying it's bad because it is, it's worse than you think it is. The
yeah.
talent is hiding. The talent's hiding how bad this is, and it
How
will.
inept the play calling and
Yes,
positioning, especially on defenses. You
it,
mentioned the tackling. The tackling is bad because the positioning is bad. Zeke Berry was a 97 composite rated player coming out of high school. He is a great player. We know that. And he whiffs on tackles because he doesn't know quite where he needs to be pre-snap. And then the play is called, and on a little screenplay or something that Mikey Sanders still would have sniffed out last season, he's just not there. He's not there to make the tackle that would have been made. It's
yeah.
frustrating.
And then Kirk Campbell. I mean, Michigan's already running like 2 out of every 3 plays, but
Yeah.
the times they choose to pass
Oh,
are nonsensical. Like 3rd and
yeah.
short, pass. Like just run up the middle, and if you fail, go for it again. That's
Yeah.
all you have.
You should have
And
really
then
leaned into your run game this season.
yeah, and they're learning. I think they're actually getting better. The staff is every game. The problem is I don't like it's not going to be good enough. It's not
Yeah.
unless they come out and they smash Illinois.
Yeah.
I'm not going to have I won't have faith that this season will be successful at all. Because success to me, maybe I can lower the bar to 9-3. Maybe. Because now that means you beat one of Oregon or OSU and
Yeah.
everyone else losing to one of them probably.
Mhm.
Or maybe you lose to Indiana on the road but beat both of those. If
Mhm.
Indiana is that good, I would take that. But
Mhm.
anything below 9-3, I said entering the year, is a failure. I don't care
Mhm.
that the national title was won the previous season. This is a blue blood school. It's the same thing with Ohio State, with USC, with Penn State. Nebraska's kind of an exception because they've been so bad and they're rebuilding. Little bit with USC too, to where
Yeah.
you need time to build momentum. But it's like with Alabama right now. If they lost to South Carolina this weekend,
Mhm.
barring winning it all, the season would have been a failure,
Yeah.
even with beating Georgia, because you
Yeah.
lost to Vandy in South Carolina.
Losing to Vandy is unthinkable for Alabama fans.
It's
Yeah.
nuts.
You are preaching to the choir right now. I know we got to go. I'm going to kind of wrap this up here. I really appreciate you having you on, you coming on. I hope to see you again in the future here if you're willing to come back on.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and man, you are really preaching to the choir because I got a lot of thoughts on Michigan, kind of the ecosystem of the fandom and things in general. And it's funny to me, I'm barely old enough, just to kind of wrap up here, I'm barely old enough to remember the 97 national championship. And in 98, it was a lot of the same stuff. And the
Interesting.
team ended up 10-3. Going into that year, there was a lot of hype around. We don't have Charles Woodson, and there was another great cornerback on that Michigan team in 97 that gets forgot. But we don't have the corners again, but we'll be great. We'll be fine. We're going to run it back. And then the team failed 10-3 ultimately with a bowl win. And it was like a lot of Michigan fans, like the fandom in general, is just programmed to only expect a national championship like once every a generation. And I'm sorry, but like you said, it's a blue blood school. Michigan has all the resources in the world. They're one of the finest universities in the entire world. If my academics were good enough to get into Michigan, I would have went to Michigan. It's a great school, tons of money, tons of TV revenue and all of that, tons of big donors, all the resources in the world. There's
They're
no
more
reason why this
financed than
team,
a lot of schools,
than
sorry to
tons of
interrupt,
schools.
that
No,
are
no, no, you're
performing
good.
ahead of them.
Yeah,
Like in
yeah,
football right now, there
yeah,
are rosters that, like, Wink
mhm,
Martindale's paid $2 million a year to do
yeah.
what? Let
Thank
you
you.
convert on 3rd and
Right.
long?
Yeah. Be 115th in pass efficiency defense. Yeah.
It's bad.
Yeah, yeah. But I know we could rant about it all night. I do want to answer Nick's question real quick. Yes, I'm done with Ron Bellamy. I think Sam, you would probably agree too.
Yeah, I would. The
I don't
the
think we need to really. Yeah, go ahead.
everyone except for Tony Alford and maybe Steve Kasula and Grant Newsom,
Yeah,
who I would give more time, but, actually Kirk Campbell, I think's done well. Oh, um, no. 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 Him, like, both as a he can recruit, but I haven't seen any indication that he can develop because McCarthy
yeah.
may have just been that good of a college QB to where
McCarthy
all
was
he
the
needed
best.
was experience and he could
Yeah,
develop himself. But
yeah,
Bellamy, yeah, yeah, Nick. I'm done with Bellamy. I don't like Kirk Campbell. On a note for the defense, everyone except Lou Esposito and maybe Lamar Morgan because like
yeah.
Yair Hill is improved.
Oh, a lot.
Um,
Yeah.
but Brian Jean Marie and Wink Martindale need to go. And then for I'd even jump to Ohio State. If they lose to Penn State and it's another game where they don't get a sack and Penn State outrushes them, and especially if the offensive line, because with Simmons gone, that O line could be weak. That's something that I said in the preseason. Michigan, Oregon, and Penn State have all out recruited Ohio State, both in bodies and higher quality players from high school. Like they all have way deeper offensive lines compared to Ohio State. Ohio State may have the best starting five, although I think that's doubtful.
Mhm.
But beyond that, they don't have much. Well, now the the most important position, arguably, in Josh Simmons, left tackle, sadly, he's out for the season. And they've suffered some like
Mhm.
injuries
That was a
here and
big
there
loss they
too.
had. Yeah.
So if their O line like takes a big step back with that one injury, which is a big injury, but you got to get through it, and the D line continues to underperform, I'd say you're looking at if Day does what he has done, like is he's consistent with his hirings and firings, and if he's smart, you're probably looking at Larry Johnson retiring and Justin Fry being fired because
Yeah.
their trench play, it's good, it's great, but it's been that way for now 3 years in a row. It's
Mhm.
failed to take that elite step. And as for Michigan, they're objectively trash at wide receiver and quarterback. We don't need to talk about
I'm
that anymore.
glad you're willing to admit it. Just playing Kendrick Bell more snaps than Frederick Moore is just a crime. But
Or more than
yeah.
Tyler Morris.
Oh yeah. Well, it's been great talking to you, Sam. I know I kept you about 15 minutes longer than
Oh,
you
no,
really
you're
could be
good.
on tonight, but this is how much Sam loves talking college football, everybody. Go subscribe to his channel if you haven't already. Check it out. He does great work on all things college football at large, by the way. Sam, do you got any more pluggables you want to plug and things you want to say before we get out of here tonight?
Not really. Thank you for having me on, Darren. Hope to come on soon, and I'll be
Yeah.
talking to you.
Yeah. It was,
Email me if you can after this.
oh,
Just
yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and we will be back next Monday, everybody. Like, share, subscribe, and all that good stuff. And as always, be kind to other people out there.
Yes.